Well, now we have you twice, even better. Well, we have your hand on one and we have you on the other. Good thing we can edit.
There we go. Sorry,
I can see why you've never gone live, Paul.
Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
This is Paul Johnson with The Optimistic American. Now, in today's roster, we have definitely a full set of issues. We're going to talk about Israel and America's college campuses, political reform, and we're even going to talk about the Hunter Biden case. But I want to start with a small editorial about Western values and whether they're worth defending. I want to spend a few moments talking about a poll that was done by the Harvard Capps Harris, which pointed out that 72% think Israel should continue the war and invade Rafah. Now, that'll be surprising to a number of people, that after months of Israel being pounded by negative media and TikTok posts and headlines that have continued to spin the blame on Israel. As an example, this week, when Israel went into Gaza to rescue 4 hostages, when the IDF was leaving the building with the hostages, they came under fire from Hamas fighters who were armed with rocket-propelled grenades and RPGs. Now, it's impossible to know who fired first, but Hamas fired into the building that the IDF was rescuing the hostages. Hamas fired from another building using human shields. They knew that when the IDF fired back, that it would kill civilians. It's a fair guess that both killed civilians. Yet it's curious to understand some of the headlines that put the death toll on the back of the rescuers, the back of the IDF. Now, these are facts. There's almost no way to know, number one, how many civilians died. You certainly can't trust the figures that come from Hamas. Number two, that of the dead, it's hard to know which were civilians and which were Hamas soldiers firing on the IDF. Number three, to know which civilians were killed by Hamas and which by the IDF. Yet many of the headlines said that the IDF killed 200. It would be equally as fair for a headline to say that Hamas was trying to stop the rescue hostages, killed 200 people. Maybe a more truthful headline would be that Hamas and the IDF kill civilians in a hostage rescue. Now, I have no doubts that there were civilians who were killed and that some were killed from the IDF fire. This is a war. War is just a terrible thing. But there is also a reason that the overwhelming amount of Americans support Israel. Americans understand what it means to be targeted from people who have a jihadist point of view. We understand the danger of a radical ideology. We learned in World War II how a government controlled by a radical ideology can promote genocide. We saw in our war on terrorism how jihadism could convince young men to not only martyr themselves, but to convince them that killing Westerners would somehow or another take them into paradise. Or in this picture, this mom who carries her baby in one arm and a detonator to a bomb in the other. This is not a picture of a woman who is oppressed, but it's someone who's been brainwashed by a radical doctrine. Groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Islamic Revolution, and the Muslim Brotherhood, who literally convince parents to strap a vest loaded with bombs on their children. And even though these groups have killed more Muslims than Christians or Jews, they believe that it's justified because if they were good Muslims, they'd go to paradise anyway. The 75% of us in this poll know this because we're old enough to have lived through it. We know better than to blame this on Israel. We saw the same thing in 9/11. We know that Israel was blamed for blowing up a hospital, only to find out a week later that it was Hamas rockets that destroyed the hospital. We understand all too well the fog of war, but most importantly, We understand radical ideologies and jihadism, and we know who is to blame. It's shown here in this polling question that 71% of Americans still blame Hamas for this war. We understand that in the process of striking back, that oftentimes people who do not deserve to die, they do die. Now, we don't excuse it, but we do understand it. If you're an American protester who truly cares about the innocent civilians who are dying, maybe you should think about, why have all the protests to date only increased support from your fellow Americans for Israel? Why does it have zero effect here at home politically and with Israel? Now, we know that many of you weren't alive during 9/11. You don't recall the war's terror because you weren't alive yet, but you don't need to understand it. However, if you really care about the loss of innocent lives in Gaza, then think about the message that might convince other Americans of your cause. Here's a message that would be much more successful with Americans. Let the hostages go. I can make you one guarantee. As long as Hamas holds on to these hostages, Israel has the high ground. For Hamas, if they want their radical extremist point of view to survive, let the hostages go. Unfortunately, there is a downside to letting the hostages go, and that is the very real possibility that if they did let the hostages go, the world would force Israel to back off and Hamas would take back control. There are more hostages in Gaza than just the hostages that are Israelis. There are women hostages. There are gay hostages. The Gaza civilians who are ripped off of billions of dollars from a government that not only spends this money on missiles and tunnels instead of housings and prosperity, but whose prosperity has also been in the billions of dollars that they have stolen from the Gaza people for themselves. If you look at these slides, you'll see almost $11 billion are held by the three people who run Hamas in Qatar. Netanyahu has certainly made some mistakes. The biggest one, he hasn't framed this war correctly. He hasn't framed that he should care not only for the Israeli hostages, but for the millions of women and gays and other Palestinians who've been taken hostage by Hamas as well. But you can show that you care for all human life if you're a protester by including the innocent Palestinians as well as the Jews slaughtered on October 7th, demanding that Hamas let the hostages go. Now, I am still one of those who believes that most of you who are American protesters came with good intentions. You don't see that the people around you who are organizing these events and the significant trails of money coming from very radical organizations that were prepped to take advantage of the goodness of young people like yourselves. But the slogan would actually change the world. Hamas, let the hostages go now. Not just the Jewish hostages, the women hostages held in a gender apartheid under jihadism, as Bill Maher said. The daughters who face honor killings for the fact that they embarrassed their family for being raped. The gays who are held hostage. People who don't support the radical views of Hamas and are terrorized about speaking up. Now remember, Sinwar, who planned the October 7th event, he wasn't jailed originally for killing Jews. He was arrested and he was put in jail because he murdered Palestinians who spoke up against radical jihadism. Maybe if you pick a unifying message, we can join you in a truly trying to find a better future for those people, including Palestinians, who are truly being held hostage today. Now, if you like where it is that we're going on this, the panel does a great job of discussing it. Press that subscribe button and let's get going. First, I'd like to welcome all of my guests here today to the New Frontiers. First, we have Bob Robb, who was a columnist with the Arizona Republic, is now on Substack. Bob, how are you doing today?
Doing well, thank you.
And then we have Professor Henry Thompson, who is with us as well. Henry, how are you and baby Arthur doing?
We're doing fine, thank you, Paul. The whole family's doing pretty well, despite the heat.
And last, we have Elliot Pollack, who is an economist. Elliot, thanks for being on with us today.
Thank you.
All right. So here's the first question that we're going to start with. This week, there was a pretty heroic rescue that took place inside of Gaza. There were four hostages that had been held in Gaza, and the IDF went in to rescue them. They had gained some great information on it, and the information that they were given actually ended up being correct, and they were able to go pull the hostages out. Now, what's interesting about that are the headlines that came after, because the headlines that came after it said that these four hostages had been rescued. And then right behind it, it said that the IDF, to rescue those hostage, had killed over 200 Gazans. Now, a couple of things we know to be true on this particular raid. The first one is it's impossible to know how many people really were killed. We have to trust on the information that's given to us by Hamas, and that information we found over and again hasn't been that trustworthy. And from Israel's standpoint, they were trying to get in and out, so they weren't really counting. The second thing that is true is that what happened in this particular firefight is that as the IDF was coming out, according to reports, Hamas began to fire at them with RPGs and grenade launchers, and then the IDF fired back. Now, Hamas fired from behind human shields inside of one building, and they fired into another building with civilians. The IDF fired back. The reality is you couldn't tell how many people, my guess is, were killed by Hamas and how many were killed by the IDF. And the most important thing I think that is on this is those headlines could have easily have read the IDF rescued hostages, and Hamas, in order to stop the hostages from being saved, killed Gaza citizens. Now, the truth is they probably both did. But it just seems like there's this overwhelming narrative that we keep seeing in the media that is slanted against Israel, that's trying to hold Israel accountable for every death that happens there. I'd love to have your input on that. I know, Elliot, you've had some strong feelings on that, so I'll start with you.
There was actually a good article on this, a good editorial on this in the Wall Street Journal this morning. There's a term, you guys all know what Yiddish is. It's a language that was part German, part Polish, part Hebrew. And it was the language of Jews in Eastern Europe. And my parents spoke it. And it was great because they didn't know that I was able to figure out what the words were. So when they would talk about me in Yiddish, I knew what they were saying. But there's a term in Yiddish called chutzpah. And the definition of chutzpah is somebody who kills his parents and then throws himself on the mercy of the court because he's an orphan. And that's what you have here. It is absurd. It's absurd. Israel is guilty because they're going to save the hostages that have been basically imprisoned for 8 months by somebody who came in and raped and pillaged and killed, and they're portrayed as the bad guys. It is absurd. Just like this ICC, we're going to go after Netanyahu because they bring it down to the same level as if he's one of the guys who raped and pillaged and so on. The world is crazy, and the media is crazy. And if this is the golden age of media, then we got a real problem. Because common sense no longer exists. You have no right to defend yourself. It's let's make peace. The only problem is the guy you're making peace with is sworn to kill you and sworn to rape, pillage, and plunder again and again and again. And that's okay with everybody. It's absurd. These guys make Neville Chamberlain look like a hero.
I generally agree with what Elliot had to say. As a factual matter, Israel would have been happy to extract the hostages without a firefight. The firefight was initiated by Hamas to try to prevent the rescue. And it is a reality, has been for some time. It's been accentuated by circumstances today, that there is an anti-Israeli sentiment in the world, in parts of this country and in parts of our media. And the sort of obvious moral lines and who is crossing them do not seem to find a firm footing in the public discussion of this particular conflict.
I think this is another one of these examples where you have on the one side the Israelis who basically see themselves engaged in a total war, almost a similar way to the British or the Americans or the French fighting back against Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany, where essentially all means are totally on the table to get back these hostages and to subdue Hamas, or to the greatest extent destroy the Hamas command structures and kill as many of their terrorist fighters as possible. And then on the other hand, you have this narrative about proportionality. The very sort of mildest narrative could be about proportionality, that the amount of force that Israel is allowed to use to go after these goals has to be somehow proportional to the amount of death or destruction or whatever, or the danger that Hamas poses to Israel. Then you have these more extreme arguments. Some of them might revolve around human rights, that it's simply immoral and not allowed to kill any civilians in Gaza in the pursuit of Hamas and trying to free the hostages. And then you have some really radical arguments that basically say that Israel deserved what was coming to it because the attacks of October the 7th, because it's a colonizing power, etc. I'm with all of you guys. I think that I agree mostly that Israel is in the first sort of bucket there, that it's trying to fight for its survival. It's trying to get back these hostages, and to a pretty large extent, it has to do what's necessary to be able to pursue that. But that's not the way that many others see it, and there are domestic political reasons in the United States for the media and for the Biden administration to be pushing a slightly different line, or at least pushing different lines depending on what audience it's talking to. The same goes for a lot of European countries where there's a lot of pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel sentiment. And so we're sort of seeing these completely conflicting and unreconcilable worldviews play themselves out in the media, and it's pretty ugly. And I don't think it is going to change anytime soon, because I don't think people are even speaking the same language about this.
So here's what I find interesting. I'm going to put up some poll questions. It was done by the Harvard Capps Harris poll. Here's what you'll find to be interesting. I think my thought on what was going on in Israel was that if you look at what's taking place in the United States, that we have a pretty divided public on it. I do think that I did believe that they're much more unified in Israel, but I thought the U.S. was much more divided. But this poll really raises some questions about that. So this first question was, most voters think Hamas is mostly to blame for the crisis in Gaza, and they're split on the accuracy of casualties coming in. You notice on that first graph, it says, do you think that the crisis in Gaza is created mostly by Israel or mostly by Hamas? 71% say Hamas. Do you think that the number of casualties in Gaza supplied by Hamas is accurate? Now, that's a little more divided, but still, almost half of the American public does not believe that the numbers that are coming out of Gaza are accurate. This one's interesting because it really points out how the framing of the question matters when you're talking to the public. So if you look at the first one, do you favor or oppose a permanent ceasefire in Gaza? 70% of the American public favors a ceasefire. Makes sense to me. I would think most of them do. But if you ask the question differently, would you favor or oppose that ceasefire if it meant that Hamas was allowed to continue to hold hostages and Hamas were continued to run Gaza? A full 68% of the American public says that they would not support the ceasefire. On the next slide, you'll see a strong majority of voters think that Israel should move forward with an operation in Rafah. Now, this one really surprised me. The question was, should Israel move forward with an operation in Rafah to finish the war with Hamas, doing its best to avoid civilian casualties, even though there will be casualties, or should it back off now and allow Hamas to continue running Gaza? Again, 72% said that they should move into Rafah now. Most voters, on the next slide, most voters agree that Hamas should be removed from Gaza, but they're split on whether Israel or a new authority should administer. So if you look at the first graph, it says, should Hamas be allowed to continue to run Gaza, or does Hamas need to be removed? It's 78%, almost 80% of the public says they need to be taken out. But if they are removed, we're much more divided on who should be running it after that, which that doesn't seem to be a surprise to me, because I think even Israel and the rest of the world is split on who should be running it. And then the last slide here is a strong majority of voters continue to support Israel in the conflict, and 2/3 feel that Israel is trying to minimize casualties. Now, on this slide, you'll see that the first question was, in the conflict, do you support more Israel or more Hamas? 80% says Israel. But the second question says, do you think Israel's trying to avoid civilian casualties in fighting in the war against Hamas, or not trying to avoid such casualties? I am surprised, with all I've seen in the media and on TikTok, that 67% of the American public agree with that. Now, I'm going to go over a little bit more of the slide, because there were some other interesting questions on this slide that I just haven't seen in very many other polls, but I'd love to get everybody's response to this.
Well, it's interesting that the age demographics plays into it, that the people who are more favorable towards Hamas, not in total, but more favorable percentage-wise, tend to be younger, 18 to 24, and even 25 to 34, except in the one about, do you think Israel is trying to avoid civilian casualties? There, it's across the board that Israel is trying to avoid civilian casualties. So that's, to me, interesting that even the people who are, a lot of people who appear to be in favor of Hamas believe that Israel is trying to avoid casualties.
Yeah, it's again, when you watch what's going on TikTok, and then when you listen to the people who are the loudest, you would not believe that this slide is true. I do think, I kind of give some excuse to younger people. Anybody who lived through 9/11 understands what it means to be fighting a jihadist organization who's willing to strap bombs onto their children, killing other Muslims because they believe if they're good Muslims, they'll go to heaven anyway. I mean, we saw what they did in our airplanes, crashing both into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and trying to hit the White House. Most Americans who saw that have a pretty clear understanding of what a jihadist actually is and the problem that Israel's facing. But I agree with you. What has surprised me here is I would have thought that it would have just been overwhelming amongst young people, for all I'm seeing in the media, and this just doesn't reflect that. Bob, you spent a lot of time in the media. How does that happen? How do we end up with that large of a disconnect? Is it just the media trying to do what they think is being fair?
No, I think they're reflective of the minority of Americans who are motivated by what Henry described as the proportionality question. And I think the media journalists feel obligated to raise that point and hammer it home time and time again in terms of creating a comprehensive view of what's going on in Gaza. But it's worth noting that a strong majority of even the 18 to 24-year-olds and the 25 to 34-year-olds say that they support Israel more than Hamas. I think there's a overwhelming consensus in the United States that respects Israel as a civilized democratic country, doing the best they can in a dangerous part of the world, and understand that their very existence is at risk in a way that the United States hasn't really experienced since 1812. And it shows how much out of step the democratic activist factions that are in my judgment, pressuring successfully the administration to take more of a neutral role and to try to constrain the actions that Israel decides are important for their own self-defense. How out of step those people are, even among the younger demographics. But they're an important part of the activist wing of the Democratic Party. And they are having as this opinion poll illustrates, a hugely disproportionate influence on American policy.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me to think about what really is happening on this. But we've spoken about this many times. Trump definitely. I have serious concerns about Donald Trump because of what he did in the past election. But I also think that this is the type of thing where you could see that Biden could end up easily losing the election, or maybe losing the election today, based upon having to appeal to that one faction. I remember Bill Clinton a long time ago said that strong and wrong beats weak and right. And there's this sense with Joe Biden, at least on this issue, that he's in the same position that the Democratic nominee was in 1968, 1980, where he is trying to appeal to a faction and in the process looks weak. Your thoughts on that, Bob?
I agree that Joe Biden, in a variety of different ways, looks like someone who is controlled by events rather than controls events, and is showing weakness in policy that underscores the weakness that people sense in him personally because of his age. It's all sort of combining together. What's remarkable to me is that he's still essentially tied with Trump, despite being perceived as a failure in policy and a risk in terms of his growing infirmities of age.
Elliot, looks like you were going to say something.
Nope, I want to hear what Henry had to say.
All right, Henry, go ahead and answer the what we've been talking about, but I'd also like to hear your point of view on how you think the outside world sees us in the U.S. There's this sense that that as we help and support Israel, that the rest of the world, because of what's going on with the United Nations, doesn't agree with us. You've spent quite a lot of time dealing with people outside the U.S. Give me your thoughts on that.
My thoughts on the poll actually is that this word Hamas features so prominently in them. And I think that most Americans know that Hamas is a terrorist organization and that it carried out this attack on October 7th. But I don't think that there's as much understanding of how Hamas is intertwined with Palestinian society in Gaza. And so I think that maybe part of what's driving those really strong poll results in a pro-Israel direction is simply the use of the word Hamas in place of the word Palestinians. And I think that's something that, despite all the coverage of the war, that has not been done very well in the media, is to explain exactly where does Hamas's role in Gaza begin and end. To what extent can we say that that we can separate these groups out, and that the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza is separate from pursuing Hamas? And so I think that the use of the word Hamas in those polls explains the big negative response. I think that is a really negatively laden word for Americans. You were asking about.
Do you think that's fair, Henry? I mean, and here's what I mean by that. Just the idea that Hamas runs the government of Gaza. They run the schools. They run the local religious orders. They are in charge of property rights, civil rights, which don't exist. They're in charge of the court system, taxation, all those things being in their control. I don't even know how you reach an agreement with the people of Gaza unless you go through Hamas, or unless you eliminate Hamas and force them to come up with a new representative, or we select them one for them. So is it really unfair that we try to untether Hamas from the people of Gaza? in terms of how we see their views?
It's a really good question, and something that I haven't seen very good coverage of, to be perfectly honest, and explaining to the American people exactly how Hamas is intertwined in Palestinian society and what it means to try and root out this terrorist organization that simultaneously is essentially the state in Gaza. That's an incredibly challenging proposition. It's probably similar to what the United States had to do in Afghanistan, where the Taliban was so intertwined with Al Qaeda in some areas. But it's also obviously different because the Taliban was not as entwined with Al Qaeda in some geographic areas or in some aspects of governance. So I think that's a really challenging informational problem that hasn't been done a very good job of. And I think if you had substituted in those questions that you just showed the polling results, if you'd simply taken the word Hamas out and reshaped the questions to not mention Hamas and to only mention, for example, Palestinian civilian casualties, then I think the public sentiment will be much different, because Americans are broadly sympathetic to the plight of Palestinians in Gaza. It's this organization, Hamas, that has this really negative loading in the questions that lead people to have a really negative response.
I think it's worth noting that the last time there was an election at U.S. insistence, not only in Gaza but also the West Bank, Hamas won the election. And it's really this conflict that has started to create a division within Gaza, and a feeling by those residents of Gaza that Hamas is at least partially to blame for what they are currently enduring. You read comments about that more frequently. There's obviously not polling available on a question like that in these circumstances. And I have always thought that that's a fine line that Israel is walking. Whether they are creating another generation of opposition to their very existence, and resentment and a desire for retaliation by taking what may be the necessary steps to degrade Hamas to the maximum extent possible. But as I've said previously, I think that's a strategic calculation for Israel to make. And I think the tragedy for U.S. foreign policy is that Joe Biden has assumed responsibility for making that decision for Israel, and therefore made the United States on the international stage that you were discussing, Paul, responsible and accountable for Israel's actions, when in reality these should be decisions made by the Israelis.
Yeah, when you think about even Sinwar, who was kind of the architect of what happened on October the 7th, I think it's fair to say that the leadership of Hamas may actually not have been involved in the planning of October 7th, because they live in Qatar and they've made hundreds of billions of dollars. Literally, they're worth $11 billion amongst the three major ones who live in Qatar, that they've kind of stolen from the Palestinian people. I don't know that the conflict was to their advantage, but Sinwar is a different story. Sinwar was in a Jewish prison for a number of years. Now, why was he in that prison? Oh, because he murdered Palestinians who weren't, who didn't follow the orthodoxy, who would say anything good about Israel. He wasn't in jail for murdering Jews. He was in jail for murdering Palestinians. And so what happens is I'm quite sure that if we make the decision to continue to empower Hamas by allowing them to think that somehow or another there's a division between the U.S. and Israel, the people of Gaza are never going to oppose them, because opposing them would cost them their life.
Well, I think in theory there's a difference, but de facto, in fact, Hamas and the Palestinian people are one and the same at the moment. I also agree with Bob that that this is a holding action, that there is no real solution until the Arab world, especially the Palestinians, are willing to accept Israel as there, and they're not going away. And the more they keep on saying, we're going to be back, and there's going to be an October 7th all the time going forward, and that we're going to destroy you, or that Iran's going to drop nuclear weapons on you, the less likely there's ever going to be any type of meaningful peace. And so, yes, all they're doing is kicking the can down the road. And if they get 10 or 15 years out of this, I think they'll be thrilled. 10 or 15 years, all the people that Bob are talking about are kids now who basically are going to be taught to hate Israel even more. It'll start over again. There is no permanent solution until, as Goldie Meir put it, until they love their children more than they hate us, when she was referring to Israel. And so that's the joke when people say ceasefire. Like all of a sudden, the mental attitudes, the thought process of those people who are trying to destroy Israel is going to change. It's not. And I'm not sure what it's going to take to make it change. Israel walked out of the Palestinian territories, in 2006? They wanted no part of it. They didn't want to run it. And, the Palestinian people never created a state. Where's their chamber of commerce? Where are the resorts that should be there? Where's the airport? There's nothing there that suggests it's a real functioning economy. And until they get that, this is just a holding action on the part of the Israelis. And if they get 15 to 20 years out of it, that'll be amazing.
All right, let me return to the poll, because I think the next section that was interesting is to recognize how many Americans actually lay the blame for this at Iran's feet. Iran is, certainly Iran, we all know that they have proxies, both with Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. Hamas is an interesting proxy because they're Sunni as opposed to Shia. And obviously Iran is a Shia nation, but yet they support the Sunnis because, in this particular case, because they know that they're opposed to Israel. And we just spoke about, are we going to be able to get to a point where we could find Arab nations and Israel that begin to accept one another? We were seeing that with the Abraham Accords, and we know that Iran had a purpose or a reason to try to block that when this raid actually took place. But take a look at these slides. I think you'll find them interesting. The first one is, a strong majority of voters say the U.S. should sanction Iran's oil and block it from the market. Question was, should U.S. sanction Iran oil to block it from the market or continue to let them sell out their oil? 71%, surprising to me, said oil. Not sure if that question were asked different if they said, if you knew this was going to cost it was going to increase your cost of gasoline by $1 a gallon, would you be supportive of it? But nonetheless, they at least still get it. The next slide says 2 in 3 voters agree negotiating would not work with Iran, and the best way to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons are sanctions and isolation. The first question was, do you think the best way to stop Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons is to negotiate a deal with it if possible, or to place sanctions on it, isolate it, and put heavy costs to them for pursuing such weapons? 67% said yes. The next question was, do you think it's possible to negotiate a deal with Iran to stop it from obtaining nuclear weapons, or would they violate any deal to develop them anyway? And 65% said that they would. The next slide says, a strong majority of voters fear that Iran is a danger globally and agree that Iran should be stopped from having nuclear weapons. Do you think that Iran is a danger to the U.S. and the Middle East, or is it really not a big danger? And 80% said that it was. Then the question was, do you think that Iran should be allowed to have nuclear weapons, or that it must be stopped from having nuclear weapons? 80% said that it must be stopped. And then the last slide here is 3 in voters think Iran is responsible for the October 7th attacks, and most say Iran is to blame for the escalating conflict. Do you think that Iran is responsible for the attacks on Israel by Hamas and Hezbollah, or do you think that Iran is not really behind these attacks? 75% said they were. Who do you blame more for the escalating conflict in the Middle East, Iran or Israel? 69% said Iran. Comments or thoughts on this?
The comments on what to do about the Iranian nuclear program, to me, are a little bit similar to the question about how to end the Ukraine conflict, with the idea essentially being that it's very difficult to reach agreements with these sorts of belligerent actors, whether it's Iran that wants to be aggressive towards Israel and acquire nuclear weapons, or it's Russia that wants to be aggressive towards Ukraine and already has nuclear weapons. It's very difficult to reach agreements with these actors that are going to have any durability and really change their behavior if they're not backed by force. And it seems that the American public sort of understands this dilemma, but I think we're still living in this kind of a dream world where we think that if we negotiate very nicely with, Russia in the case of the Minsk agreements, or the Iran in the case of the Iran nuclear weapons deal, that they'll stick to these deals, but I don't think that they will. And that leaves us in this very troubling world where the United States and other Western countries might actually have to step up and be more willing to engage in overt conflict or forward military deployments in a way that's not popular with the American public if they're going to achieve these goals of containing these stakes.
So, Bob, we've tried sanctions, and they do not seem to have much of an effect, even though this polling question seemed to say that Americans think we should do more. We've been pretty severe on the sanctions. We attempted to do a peace agreement where we were willing to give them back money and cash done during the Obama administration that the Trump administration scuttled. But for the most part, it didn't look like they were really becoming good actors. They were still doing these same types of things with proxies. One other issue is that you could draw harder red lines for Iran in terms of when we might respond militarily. And of course, I think every American president has drawn one red line, which is to say, we will not allow you to get nuclear weapons. Now, what we would do on that, I'm not sure, but it seems to me that they're all being fairly clear. We would use military action in the face of them getting nuclear weapons. Now, of course, this entangles us further into the Middle East. So I'd love to have your thoughts on that because you've written a bunch about it in the past.
I'm not persuaded that in the final analysis, the United States would take military action to prevent Iran from going nuclear. I think the larger question is whether we would attempt to prevent Israel from taking action militarily to prevent Iran from going nuclear. And frankly, I'm not even confident that whoever the American president is would not try to constrain Israel from taking the military action that it might be capable of taking to prevent Iran from going nuclear. There now is a sufficient economic ecosystem among the despots of the world that I don't think American sanctions any longer have the force and influence that they might formerly have had. And we're seeing this with Russia, China, and Iran exchanging oil for all sorts of assistance and sharing military capabilities and ammunition. So I think we need to become. It's something that politicians do to say that they're doing something, but I don't think we can believe anymore that it's a very persuasive instrument of our foreign diplomacy. My own view for a long time has been that we miscalculate our self-interest in the Middle East because I don't think we have much of one. And being the defender of Sunni despots against Shia despots, to me, isn't in the American self-interest. The only hope with respect to Iran is a revolution among their people. And I don't think the United States trying to foment that adds or assists to it. It's something that is either going to happen organically or not. To the extent covert action is useful in facilitating it, I think the Israelis are far more capable and better at that sort of thing than we are. It is obviously Iran developing a nuclear weapon will be a hugely destabilizing influence. But I'm not sure we have it in our means or that we have the will to ultimately prevent it from happening. We need internal forces within Iran preventing that from happening.
Wouldn't you see, though, that as being, to me, that would be one of the biggest leaps in nuclear proliferation that we've had maybe in 40 years, because the minute Iran gets it, Saudi Arabia is going to want it. Now, Saudi Arabia would try first to reach an agreement with the U.S. that says, hey, we'd like you to be able to cover our any military exposure that we may have from any type of nuclear assault by Iran. But they have the means and the money to buy their own. And my guess is that would become their next step. They would begin to work on maybe leapfrogging the idea that they have to go out and refine fuel and create their own weapon. They just could go out into the market and buy it from a North Korea. To me, that seems to me to begin to become a very big challenge, allowing Iran to get a nuclear weapon. You want to comment on that, Bob?
I agree, and the Biden administration is working very hard at developing a treaty to provide U.S. security guarantees, including extension of our nuclear umbrella to Saudi Arabia, which I think is a terrible, terrible thing for us to do, either morally or strategically. And it would be the first security treaty we have with an authoritarian nation. And one of the worst human rights abusers in the entire world. And to the extent the geopolitical conflict of our time is between authoritarianism and democratic capitalism, to me, it is both morally and strategically a mistake. I agree that it would be proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East would be terribly alarming. But the U.S. providing a nuclear deterrent, pledging a nuclear deterrent to uphold the stability and longevity of the House Assad is, to me, even worse than that.
Elliot, is Iran the bad guy in your mind?
Well, Iran is the bad guy. And what bothers me is that historically, anytime Israel thinks that Iran was getting close, they found some way of delaying, of destroying research facilities, putting basically destroying computers that had a lot of the information on it. That is going to be more difficult today, I think, than has been in the past, given the fact that anything Israel does will basically face world opposition. And I'm not sure where it goes. All I know is that if I'm Israel, I'm going to do everything I can to prevent these guys who say they're going to use their nuclear weapons on me from getting it. And, you know, this, again, I look back at 1938 and 1939 when there was a chance of stopping Hitler before it all got started, but we didn't. And I really think that's where we are now. Now it's upon the Israelis to somehow figure out if Iran's close and somehow figure out how to derail the program and kick that can down the road. And I just don't know where it exactly stands. Iran has said it's been close to a nuclear weapon before, but nothing ever happens. But it seems that it's getting closer. But I would hope that Israel had both the nerve and the sanction from its allies to go after these guys before it happens.
Don't you think that, I mean, to me, that's what the entire action with Hezbollah is really about. I know they're trying to get them back a few kilometers away from the border itself, but Hezbollah has at least somewhere over 100,000 missiles that they can launch into Israel. Now, why do they need that many missiles? To me, that's the deterrent that Iran needs to be able to finish their nuclear program. They put those missiles next to the border of Israel, knowing that if Israel strikes Iran, that they can get Hezbollah to strike them back.
Yeah. Well, it's a problem. And Iran now knows how many missiles it has to fire at once to actually get something through. And that's, a lot more than 300. But the bottom line is, if they do get a nuclear weapon, why would any sane person believe that they're lying about using it?
All right. So let's go to this last section of the poll, because I thought that these were very interesting. And Henry, I was thinking of you specifically as these slides were coming up. So the first slide says that voters who say there is a problem in higher education identify the problem as racially diverse or anti-American teachings and not having enough teachers across the political spectrum. Notice that if you look at the 40% number, teaching theories that racially divide us, 34% say having teachers that are on all sides of the political spectrum and not on our side, teaching theories that promote anti-Americanism. I'm not gonna go through all of them yet. I'd like to start with that one, Henry, and just get kind of your thought. I know we've had conversations in the past about civics and the importance of teaching civics. Can you give us some thoughts on that?
I think that higher education is entering some really choppy waters. There's a declining support for higher education across the board in the United States. There's less willingness to pay the high cost of higher education. And then if you layer on top of it this kind of political polarization that's happening in the country writ large and apply it to the universities, such that the universities are really only they're sort of seen as being in the Democratic camp or even in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party's camp, that is going to be bad. It's going to lead to fewer people going to university, fewer people getting exposed to different ideas. It's also going to have a knock-on effect that conservatives aren't going to go on to graduate school and to become university instructors. I mean, there are already so few conservatives among the professoriate, something like between 5 and 10% maximum across many elite institutions, conservatives. The idea that the universities are just becoming kind of Democratic Party training schools is really bad, not only for the universities, because it's going to lead to even fewer people wanting to come here, but it's also bad for society because we need functioning public universities to train people for all sorts of jobs and for them to be able to go out into the economy and earn money and start companies and do all sorts of good things, become doctors and lawyers and all sorts of things. So I see these sorts of figures as going hand in hand with a broader kind of impending or maybe already arrived crisis in higher education. It's really, really worrying.
In academia, as in journalism, I think you're naturally going to see more people left of center than right of center. I think right of center people tend to be attracted to business and industry, and rather than either journalism or academia. What's changed is that for those who were so inclined, they were welcome and there was a place for it. There was tolerance of a diversity of point of views, and there was a value placed on conservative scholars. That is something that is dying, both in academia and in journalism. It is sort of, they have become, at least on social issues, pretty much indoctrination factories. And the diversity, equity, and inclusion woke ideology controls events, including personnel. And I think that is, as Henry described, a crisis that I think it's not impending. I think it has reached academia. It has, to a lesser extent, but a still troublesome extent, infected mainstream journalism. I don't know I believe we are beginning to see a pushback from the American people to the woke ideology. We'll see the way that these institutions respond to that. I'm not hopeful that they will respond by a return to a greater degree of tolerance and a welcoming spirit to a diversity of intellectual voices and ideas.
All right, so that's the question, Bob. I think you framed that actually perfectly, which is there any hope that the universities are going to reform? And again, I like pointing out Henry teaches at ASU. I don't think the problem is that big at ASU. I could be wrong. I'd love to hear Henry's position on it. I think it tends to be more in our Ivy League or most competitive universities that we're seeing the challenge beginning to exist. My hope is that what Bob and I have talked about in the past, what we've talked about on this panel in the past is true. I think woke ideology is in the retreat. I am much less worried about it today because of all the free speech that's happened around it that's begun to kind of push back on it. And I'm even hearing pushback from students. My question is, will all the pressure, and there's a ton of pressure from the American public who believes that our universities are out of touch, that they're allowing anti-Semitism on campus or allowing Jewish students. There's other questions in this poll I could have brought up where a large percentage of Americans believe that the universities are not doing enough to stop the anti-Semitism on campus. But they're also not happy, obviously, in this portion of the poll that we're not being more balanced. And, there are a number of studies that point out that literally, from a psychological standpoint, you only really need literally one introduction in a course campus that is teaching this idea of the oppressed and the victim to begin to have a long-term effect on the view. But at least if the universities were providing the opposite, giving students the ability to have a balance in those elite colleges, maybe that would be effective. My question is this: all the pressure that is on, is it going to change our universities? Henry?
I think you have to distinguish, as you said, between the really elite colleges and between large public institutions, which are going to be different. I think that there are strong tendencies towards this trend not changing. I think I've discussed previously the huge proportion of professors that come from a tiny proportion of elite schools, which are the exact same schools that are in the press for having these problems with anti-Semitism and things right now, are the same schools that are staffing most academic departments across the country with their PhDs. The professors are coming from those elite colleges. But there's a sort of extent to which these ideas propagate from the elite out to the rest. Not as extreme at public institutions because, as you say, about public pressure and the opinions of people in the states across the country that diverge from those of the faculty that come from the elite institutions. But there's still very strong institutional reasons to believe that this problem is going to persist. When it comes to somewhere like ASU, I read a statistic just this morning that ASU awards something like 7 degrees in STEM for every degree in the humanities and liberal arts. So I would almost say that a tiny proportion of ASU students are ever confronted with political ideas and political ideologies at all, let alone the more radical ones. So it could be that the problem is very visible because the liberal arts are much more dominant at the elite institutions, because a lot of them kind of are research universities like Harvard and Princeton, etc., that grew from liberal arts colleges where the social sciences and liberal arts are really powerful. But when parents send their kids to a place like ASU, if they're going to study engineering or business or all sorts of huge majors here at the university, they're just really not impacted by this ideology. So it could be that the problem is not as big at a place like ASU or any other big public university as it is at the elite levels.
That makes sense. Elliot?
Yeah, I agree with Henry. Harvard's got a $42 billion endowment. They're going to do whatever they damn please. As the demographics for college become a lot weaker, as they will over the next decade or 15 years. It's not the elite schools that are going to have problems getting students. It's the 95% of universities and colleges below them. And I think that's where you'll have the marketplace help making the judgment about what they teach. Because if they become known as a woke school, they're going to really be keeping their market down to people who want their kids with that type of training. Most schools will basically get back to more basic education, which I think we need. We also need it, obviously, in K through 12. But it's the elite schools with large endowments really are going to do what they please. It's everybody else that's going to really react to market conditions, if you will.
All right, I'm going to jump now to the last 3 slides because I think there's a lot of good news in those slides. I'm going to start with slide 6, which has some mixed results in it. All right, so first, if you look at this slide, the military and the police are trusted more by almost 2 in 3 Americans. The FBI, the Supreme Court, they're trusted by over half, while other institutions are not as well trusted. And you know, sometimes I worry because the attack on institutions has been pretty severe on the right and the left. I was about to say on the right, but to be fair, I think on both sides. But yet the military still scores very high. Police departments, and you know, in my experience, I'm not saying there aren't problems on departments at times, but in my experience, for the most part, the departments that I've worked with are very good. And to say that there's systematic racism in them, it actually harms our ability to solve the real problem. But if you look at the polling, the majority of the public overwhelmingly supports it. The FBI, even the Supreme Court's over the top. Now, it's not hard to see where president and Congress start to fall down in terms of those numbers. If you have a Democratic president, the Republicans are going to hate it. If you have a Republican president, the Democrats are going to hate it. And Congress tends to fall in that as well. I'm a little discouraged by the media, but I think that the media and social media companies are oftentimes conflated. The next slide is slide number 5, and that voters say that the right to vote, the right to privacy, and the right to a fair trial are the most important thing to being an American. And that, to me, is right on. I mean, it's exactly where we should be. But it's this last slide that I'd really like to draw your attention to, because to me, this is the most encouraging. This last slide says 9 in 10 voters across party IDs agree that the government needs to draw the best ideas from both parties and focus on finding solutions. You know, when you look at this, sometimes I have this sense that we've become so partisan, so divided that no one is ever going to agree to listen to people on the other side. But what this poll is showing us, when you recognize that a little over a third of the public is independent, you still have to have pretty big segments of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party that believe in these ideals. Like, we need a government that draws the best people and ideas from both parties. Our politics has become too much about fighting and not enough about finding solutions. Bipartisan compromise is better than single-party control of the government. Bipartisan compromise is better than gridlock. When you look at those numbers, they're pretty overwhelming on the side of looking for a political system that works. Now, around the country, we're starting to see things like open primaries become a much hotter topic. But part of, I think, the reason that that's happening is, one, I think that a lot of that's driven by the 2 people running for president, and somewhere between 70 and 80% of the public not liking either choice. But it's also being driven by the idea that the public is becoming tired of seeing this not only political gridlock, but this constant barrage on the American brand. This will be kind of our last topic, but Bob, I'll start with you on it.
Well, the residual confidence that people have in some of our institutions may be a point of optimism, but if you look at it over time, even among those that currently retain a high degree of confidence, the numbers are down and down considerably from what they were in the past. So I do think that a declining confidence in our institutions is a serious problem. And some of them deserve declining confidence, unfortunately. I think I think the term bipartisan and compromise receives more support in polls than it does by voters when they actually cast their ballots. I think what people really want is government that works, government that addresses the problems, and to the extent a solution can be forged, finds a way to enact it. And the problem is that our current political uh, system um, uh, doesn't provide, doesn't benefit candidates who want to do that, either in a partisan fashion, working with their own political colleagues, or in a bipartisan fashion, as opposed to politicians who are performance artists, are more interested in getting the hits on social media, or inflaming a partisan audience, than they are actually getting something done. And I think it's a combination of a two-party system that has served the country well for most of our history, and particularly if you compare the stability in our ability to govern to what tends to prevail in multi-party systems, you have to say that our track record has been superior. But given the changes that have occurred within the two parties, I think we're to the point now that our two-party system is a detriment rather than an advantage, because it disadvantages the candidates who want to get something done, which is what people want, irrespective of whether they're on the left, the right, or the center.
All right. So, Bob, before we started the program, there was a great discussion going on. I wish we would have caught it on tape, talking about a loss of faith in the institutions. And to me, that seems to wrap itself around this idea of, do we trust elites? This week, we have the Hunter Biden trial. And one of the things that I find to be fascinating is the loss of faith that's happened in the media because of Hunter Biden, right? So we had this laptop that was handed over to the New York Times. The New York Times decided at the end of the campaign, I don't remember if there were 10 days or 15 days, but there were very few days left before the race itself. And so they decided to not put out the information on it. The New York Post did, the New York Times didn't, and then Twitter kind of boxed out the New York Post from doing that. Now, I can see where that leads to a level of distrust, that there's some elite making a decision as to whether or not I'm going to get the information to be able to decide for myself. The reverse of that, though, is one thing I know from politics is, if I know that you have this game, that you're going to keep playing this information until the end, and I can come forward with a laptop that has 10,000 emails on it that's the son of a president, and it shows him snorting coke off the breast of some hooker, that's going to completely take over the airwaves, and it's going to create an environment where it will be damaging to one of the candidates. And if political operatives like Rudy Giuliani know that you will play that, of course they're going to give it to you, and they're going to wait. They're going to hold it for months and wait until that last 10 days so they can create that confusion. Part of this seems to me is that the ground rules aren't set. I kind of recall, maybe this is in my own mind, but I kind of recall the Arizona Republic used to have a blackout period where they'd say, no, there's a period of time that if you're going to release damning information about your opponent, we're not going to play it. But how should the media be responding to a complex question like that one? Because again, I can see both sides of that.
I don't think that they should calculate the potential results as opposed to the newsworthiness of it. And unfortunately, they tend to put an emphasis on what is scandalous rather than what is important. The reality is that what was on Hunter Biden's laptop for the most part, was unimportant. There was some information on it about the potential involvement of his father in some of his business deals that was and remains relevant. But I don't believe that the media should be in the business of making news decisions based upon their potential consequence. And so I think you have to side on disclosure, hopefully emphasizing true newsworthiness rather than what's going to get social media clicks. But then trust the judgment of the American people to sort it out. I mean, when you consider the damaging information that came out about Donald Trump towards the end of the 2016 campaign, and the fact that he still won, there seems to be the ability of the American people to discount for a lot of that and weigh their way through it. But the media shouldn't be a gatekeeper. It should be a medium of disclosing newsworthy information.
I agree with Bob. And the more that the media holds information back and then discloses it later, the less credibility they have. And so I think they're hurting themselves just not by saying, here's what we have, we're putting it out there as we've gotten it, and we don't know exactly what's true and what's not, but this is what we've got. And let the American people decide. I think that's the best way to do it, because every time they hold something back, and then something comes out that, well, would more people have voted for Trump than Biden last time if they knew about Hunter Biden and what he had done? Who knows? But it's the type of thing where that decision shouldn't be made in a newsroom. It should be made by every individual who looks at that information.
I would like to actually disagree with Bob on his moderate support for the American two-party system. I think that the robust, sometimes unruly, sometimes impolite, sometimes outright crazy debates that we have in America are good. They lead new ideas to be aired and debated and discussed in a way that doesn't happen in a lot of other places. And if you look at, you mentioned the multi-party systems in Germany, a lot of these grand coalitions that have emerged over there in Germany or in other European countries have led to a sort of a policy consensus that hasn't been good for countries like Germany. They needed more debate. They needed more radical ideas to be thrown into the political arena and discussed and hashed out. And I think that would have done those countries a lot of good. I'm looking at the British election now, which is essentially the choice between two people who are almost indistinguishable on major policy issues. I think the American people, even if they might have their big deficiencies, at least the American people have a real choice coming up in November between two different visions for the country, and the choice is clear, and probably the result will be clear as well. I think that's good for the country rather than staggering on as parties sort of try and cling on to some sort of consensus that may have been appropriate 20, 25 years ago, but might not be for the future. So here we have a rare case of me disagreeing with Bob. And luckily, because we're out of time, he doesn't get to rebut me, so I get to still sound smart.
Let me say one thing.
Oh, you can't do that,
I thought I had it.
That I think that our system will come out of this probably be healthier, certainly healthier than it is now, and will survive. And whether we go one way or the other, that's the way the American people will want to march. I think we are in an extremely trying period in American history. And I think it'll be looked back on with people scratching their heads saying, what were we thinking? But I think we will come through this. And that's hard to believe sometimes, but I really believe that we'll come through this and we'll be just fine. But I don't know which answer it's going to be.
All right, so just because Henry thought he was going to slip one in on Bob, I'm going to give Bob the last word today. If you have any zingers about New Zealand, now's a good time to use it.
I do not, but I do. I absolutely agree that a multi-party system has resulted in paralyzed government throughout Western Europe, and unhealthily so. Our system hasn't produced a choice that the American people want. They want none of the above. And I got to believe that we can have reforms to the system that results in a vision that the American people actually support, rather than a choice of which guy do you dislike the least.
Yeah, I doubt seriously the two-party system is going to go away in America. It's going to continue to play a role. The question is, are we going to give a disproportionate voice to the 8% of the people who control their partisan primary in a world where the districts are so gerrymandered that in 70% of the seats, you never have a general election? That you have to fix. You have to get more people engaged in the process. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I appreciate you for being here today, and we'll see you at the next New Frontiers.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.